Light breaks the shadow of the weary heart. Truth cuts the dark like a flaming dart. Voices rising strong to lift the call. This is the time we give it all. Lynne Scott Haggerman bringing the fire. Words that ignite hearts burning higher. Faith and power, no chains can bind. Step into the light, leave fear behind.
Hello, everybody. It's Lynne Scott Haggerman. Welcome to my, I think it's my third live podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm going to get the right screen on. So I want to welcome everyone. We have I'm just so honored by our guest today. And before I bring him on, a couple things. Since I'm new to the Patriots Pro Network, first of all, I want to give them just a sincere from the heart. I'm so grateful to be one of the podcasters now. And the scripture that's displayed for Matthew, whenever the intro comes on, that's whenever Jesus said, better a millstone be tied around their neck than them to cause harm to one of these little ones, and they be drowned in the depths of the sea with the millstone around their neck. That was really paraphrased. So let me start out, since I'm new to PPM, and I'm also so grateful to Eddie for that beautiful song that he created for me. So I'd like to tell you just a little bit about my background before I bring my guest on, so that way everyone gets familiar with me. Let me tell you who I am today, and then let me tell you what used to be and will be no longer. Today, I'm an international award-winning human resource consultant. I'm an independent LifeWave distributor. I'm a marathoner. I am a weightlifter. I'm a podcaster, and I am a child of God and a follower of the Lord Jesus Christ and a friend of Holy Spirit. And I have been activated for such a time as this to be a voice for the voiceless, because whenever I was little, I was trafficked from the time I was born until I was 5 years old. I was also taken to a U.S. University medical center where I was experimented on underground in conjunction with the government through MK Ultra. And today I'm here as your podcaster, and I want to welcome my guest. Make sure I click all the buttons. There we go. Dr. Bonner Cohen. Bonner, thank you so much for being on today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I clicked the right buttons. It took just a second to get us together, but I did it. So before we start, what I want to do is to share with everyone your background, which is just astounding. So I'm going to read from a bio, because you guys are going to be so blessed by this today. Dr. Bonner Cohen is a senior policy analyst with the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, where he concentrates on energy, natural resources, and international relations. He also serves as a senior policy advisor with the Heartland Institute. He's a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research, and he's an adjunct scholar at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Articles by Dr. Cohen have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Investors Business Daily, the New York Post, the Washington Times, National Review. Wow, Bonner, this is just, this is so amazing. And I'm not done. The Philadelphia Inquirer, Detroit News, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Miami Herald, and dozens of other newspapers in the U.S. and Canada. He's been interviewed on Fox News, CNN, Fox Business Channel, BBC, BBC Worldwide Television, NBC, NPR, N24, German language news channel, Voice of Russia, and scores of radio stations in the United States, and Lynne Scott Haggerman's podcast. I'm just going to add that to the list, Bonner. There we go. I'm going to write right up there with them. Dr. Cohen has testified before the U.S. Senate committees on energy and natural resources and environment and public works, as well as the U.S. House committees on natural resources and judiciary. He's spoken at conferences in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Bangladesh. He's the author of 2 books. The first is The Green Wave, Environmentalism and Its Consequences. The second is Marshall, Maui, and Chang. Did I pronounce that right?
Marshall, Mao, and Chang. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The American Mediations Effort in the Chinese Civil War, which I encourage everyone to get both of those books. Dr. Cohen received his BA from the University of Georgia and his PhD summa cum laude from the University of Munich. Welcome, Bonner. It is truly an honor, and I mean that from the heart.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here and look forward to our conversation.
I do too. And there are 3 things that I would like to cover today. The first is climate engineering. The second are EVs. And the third is Chevron and another ruling that you were sharing pre-show. So climate engineering. You are an expert in climate engineering. In Texas, the floods in Texas is on everyone's mind. There's a lot of talk about cloud seeding and weather warfare and all kinds of terminology. People just want to understand, their hearts go out to these families that have been impacted. I was talking to a pastor recently, and he was giving 6 or 7 funerals a day for the next month. There's someone I had on a show with boots on the ground, bringing semi-truckloads of supplies to survivors. I mean, it's on everyone's hearts. And so people are trying to understand why. What happened?
Well, what happened in Texas on July 4th, in a part of Texas known as the Texas Hill Country, which is about 25 miles northwest of San Antonio, was not brought about by cloud seeding or geoengineering, but rather was the result of a slow-moving tropical storm that was actually already beginning to fade out, but still contained a tremendous amount of rainfall. That tropical storm was called Barry. And this part of the world, the Texas Hill Country, is known as Flash Flood Alley. And it's known as Flash Flood Alley for a very good reason. There are well-documented incidences of flash floods there going back to the mid-19th century. That has a lot to do with the dusty hills that are around there, hills that overlook the Guadalupe River. And when occasionally you get a fierce thunderstorm or series of thunderstorms or remnants of a hurricane or a tropical storm, it was the latter that happened 3 weeks ago, the rain can come down on those very dusty hills, which are underpinned by limestone, which is very slick, which means that the water that comes down from the heavens has no place to go but downhill and into the Guadalupe River. And it did so at an incredible amounts over a short period of time. There was ample warning from the National Weather Service that something very bad was on its way, but what actually happened was far worse than anyone could have imagined. And what really made it tragic was it struck around 1 o'clock in the morning when locals were asleep, and that included a lot of young girls who were in religious camps there, Camp Mystic. They're very popular campgrounds there. And they were simply overwhelmed by what had happened. Looking back, if you want to point the finger at who or what was responsible for this, well, first and foremost, this is Mother Nature. Those things simply happen. But I do think that local officials going back years should have taken the advice of many who were familiar with the area and said, look, Why don't we have warning sirens when something like this happens? That's particularly important if it happens in the middle of the night, which is what went on here. No amount of how many people were watching the television at 1 o'clock in the morning, or were on their smartphones, or otherwise on the internet. No, most of these people were sleeping. Had they heard sirens, one wouldn't have sufficed. You needed a bunch of them blasting away, with it understood that when you hear that siren, you get to higher ground and you get there immediately. I think the camp counselors there would have gotten those girls up. They were not sleeping in tents. They were sleeping in cabins overlooking the Guadalupe River. Said, girls, we need to get out of here. We need to get to higher ground. We will never know how many lives could have been saved. But I don't doubt for a moment that a whole bunch of them would have been, because they did have just enough warning to scamper to higher ground. Now, again, it was an interesting thing. A low-tech, relatively inexpensive measure such as sirens could have saved a lot of lives. Now, in the aftermath of the tragedy, there was talk about what did geoengineering or cloud seeding have to do with this? Well, the answer, fascinating as both of those subjects are, they had nothing to do with what happened in Texas 3 weeks ago. There had been a case of cloud seeding. Now, people may ask, what is cloud seeding? Here we have to differentiate between kind of fooling with the weather and fooling with the climate. Cloud seeding is a technology that's been around for about 80 years. It was developed in the mid-1940s toward the end of World War II. And you can sprinkle clouds during a drought where, say, farmers or ranchers desperately need moisture. They need precipitation, and they're not getting it. And you can sprinkle that with a substance called silver iodide, and you can induce those clouds to produce precipitation. And if you're a farmer, your crops desperately need rainfall. That can be an intelligent thing to do. It's a cost-benefit analysis. These things are cheap, but they can produce precipitation, and maybe in a drought that will save your crop. It turns out that there had been very localized cloud seeding a couple of days before the floods.
Right.
But the floods that struck that area had nothing to do with that. They were caused by something else larger. So the narrative that this was somehow brought about by cloud seeding is simply not true. I think it's also important to differentiate between the local technique of cloud seeding and geoengineering, which aims at changing not local weather conditions, but the entire climate of the Earth. The former is marginal in whatever effect it may have, but whatever that effect is, it's fairly limited. The latter, I think, is opening up a tremendous can of worms and is something we should avoid at all cost. One of the most infamous schemes for geoengineering aimed at changing the world's climate, supposedly to combat human-induced climate change, formerly known as global warming, involves sucking carbon dioxide, CO2, out of the atmosphere. This is being done, we are told, because atmospheric levels of CO2 have risen to be so high that this is leading to a potentially catastrophic warming of the Earth. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a false narrative. There is zero truth in that. Our climate, the one that we as human beings have been living with ever since we have been around, our climate is chaotic. What you see today isn't necessarily what you're going to see tomorrow. Throughout human history, we have had to adapt to whatever the climate threw at us. Over the course of the last 2 million years, there have been 17 ice ages. That means on 17 different occasions, the climate cooled off so much that giant sheets of ice formed in the North Pole and on occasion came as far south as Kentucky. And on 17 different occasions, the planet warmed up, and it warmed up on its own, no human influence whatsoever, that these giant glaciers melted. And this has been the pattern. We today, in the year 2025, are living in an interglacial period, which means we're living between the last ice age and the next one. When's the next one coming? We don't know. If the past is any indication, probably in another 7 to 10,000 years. Now, I'm sure our viewers have heard the term climate change, human-induced climate change. It is premised on the notion that the levels of CO2 in the air have gotten so high that they are causing temperatures to rise, and that poses a threat to the future of the planet. I don't believe that for a minute. Today's temperatures are actually lower than there were during the Middle Ages. They were also lower than they were during the time of the Roman Empire. And as far as atmospheric levels of CO2, there have been points in our past, say during the age of the dinosaurs, when CO2 levels worldwide were 20 times higher than they are today. Yet there was no runaway greenhouse gas effect. I would add, I think the most criminal thing we could do would be to lower atmospheric levels of CO2. Why? Because that will have a devastating effect on plant life around the world. In other words, on us as well as wildlife, and it's a particularly devastating effect on agriculture. We have 8 billion people in the world. We have to feed them somehow, and agriculture is the way we do that. And the lower the atmospheric level of CO2, the harder it is to grow crops. I would argue that rather than trying to lower atmospheric levels of CO2, we should welcome the fact that CO2 levels, currently around 420 parts per million, are rising. We could easily do to double that. It would be good for agriculture, which means it's good for food security, and that ultimately means it's good for human beings. So we should never allow ourselves to become a captive of a phony, false, completely scientifically unsubstantiated narrative. This is a narrative geared toward giving certain people power over our lives. It has nothing to do with climatological observations. And so we should be very careful when we hear something like that. There is no climate crisis, but we want to make sure that measures taken to combat the so-called crisis, those are the ones that can go haywire. They can go haywire in many ways if you wind up spending more for your energy than is absolutely necessary. You can cause famines if you lower the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. All sorts of bad things can happen when we try to play God. So let's not.
You are a wealth of information, and I could camp on this one topic for the whole hour. We won't, but I still have a couple questions. I believe the vast majority, if not all, of the patriots listening are very, very concerned about this topic. And do you know who it, because I mean, you've done a brilliant job explaining why this is wrong, the harm it's going to do. It would be a depopulation event.
Yes, of course. Mm-hmm.
And who is behind this? Do you know who is behind this?
The whole notion of human-induced global warming actually goes all the way back to the 19th century. And there it languished in well-deserved obscurity. It originated in Europe, mostly in Germany, but spread, in certain chattering classes over there. It languished in well-deserved obscurity until it was picked up. The two prominent figures initially in this were Al Gore, the former vice president. He took a course in college, which we all wish he hadn't taken. He heard this theory, and to him it became the holy gospel. And he was the one who made it who popularized the whole idea, first in the United States and then in the rest of the world. In Europe, the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was also instrumental, every bit as intrigued by the idea as Gore. Neither man knew what he was talking about, but each man had a stage to perform on, and perform they did. There are people who stand to benefit from this narrative. These are the purveyors of so-called green technologies that we are told can address this emerging climate crisis. These are people who develop wind farms, so-called wind farms, when the only thing they really farm there, the only thing they really produce are subsidies. Wind farms, solar farms, electric vehicles, a subject we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Yes.
These are part of what is called the climate cartel. These are people standing to make a lot of money, provided people are scared enough to embrace those technologies in the false belief that this is what should be done to save the planet. So yes, and then environmental groups who have long-standing ties to the whole notion of eugenics, population growth. That's who these people really are, as opposed to what they say they are. They don't really care about bugs and bunnies as much as they care about generous donations to their various groups that enable them to spread the false narrative of man-made climate change. And they have been infiltrated the media. The media has gone along with this. And for a long time, even a lot of major companies went along with this, thinking that they too could make some money off climate change, engage in virtue signaling, telling everyone how wonderful they were because their technologies and their products were green. But as I said, there was never any scientific basis for this anyway. I think we have probably reached what somebody has referred to as peak climate, or I like to refer as peak green, because there are only so many times you can say that the world is going to end in 5 minutes. And when the world doesn't end in 5 minutes or 5 years, as they confidently predicted it would, or 10 years, or whatever the prediction was, then you have a real problem. And you also have all of the stories that they have told, stories being a polite word for lies, that this particular hurricane or that particular tornado or the flood in Texas were all caused by climate change. No. There are perfectly understandable, rational reasons, climatological, scientific reasons for why the climate does what it does when it does. And I can assure you it's hubris for we human beings to believe that through our actions, we can determine the climate of the world, or that what we have done through our use of fossil fuels or certain agricultural techniques have contributed to this dangerous warming of the planet. My advice is don't believe it for a minute.
I love your advice. So in terms of current administration or current things being done to combat this hoax, do you see action steps being taken to stop this insanity of this climate climate hoax? Do you see any steps being taken? Is there hope?
Yes, in fact, it's remarkable what has happened just in the last 6 months. The Trump administration has rolled back one climate rule or regulation or policy after the other.
Oh,
And
good.
this giant edifice of control that was erected, actually, this goes back even as far as the Clinton administration, picked up during the Obama administration, then went full throttle during Biden's 4 years in office. Uh, this is being slowly but surely. Actually, let me rephrase that. It's not being slowly dismantled; it's being rapidly
Oh,
dismantled.
good.
And this is at the time almost entirely an American phenomenon. Europe's, as always, laggard. But we're the ones who really matter. Do not be too subtle about it and not be too modest about it. And
I don't think subtle is in your vocabulary, Bonner.
no. This is a very positive thing. How positive it is can be seen in the wailing and gnashing of teeth on the part of green activists, as well as developers of wind power and solar power, who are seeing their subsidies phased out and their influence diminish in Washington and elsewhere. That doesn't mean that they're going to give up, pick up their marbles, and go home. They will continue to try to spread their false narrative as much as they can. But I think they're beyond their peak. As I said, there are only so many times you can say the sky is falling when it turns out the sky really isn't falling, or if in fact it is falling, but not because of climate change, but because of the monstrous policies adopted to combat climate change, policies which have lowered the disposable income of Americans, and for that matter, of other people around the world who've been subjected to these things. Think of how regressive it is. Does it really matter if, Robert De Niro or someone else in Hollywood who makes $1 zillion a year has to pay 10 or 15% more for electricity? Well, actually, no, it doesn't. But think about people living on fixed income, people living from paycheck to paycheck, forcing these people to pay more to heat their homes in winter, cool them in summer, forcing them out of their gasoline-powered vehicles into electric vehicles, which really don't even begin to meet their needs. Those policies are inherently regressive. The ones at the bottom of the economic heap are the ones who pay the highest price. So these are policies imposed by a completely out-of-touch elite on ordinary people, which, if we allow them to stay in force, will have absolutely catastrophic consequences for the vast majority of the people. There would be a slim slither of elitists who will line their pockets with this. But with a little bit of luck and perseverance on all of our parts, we can roll these policies back, which is what is currently happening here in the United States. And we can spare not only ourselves, but our children and our grandchildren the very troublesome world that they would be living in if these policies are allowed to stay in place.
So before I ask my next question, I feel a need to introduce everyone to Gracie the cat. So Gracie the cat is for our radio audience. She's a tuxedo, and she weighs about, so she's black and white. She weighs about 8 pounds, and she is going to be part of the shows because you can't control a cat, and anyone who's tried, realizes the futility of that. And she's family, so I don't want to put her in a room and close the door because then she'll cry, and I don't want that either. So Gracie the cat will make a regular appearance, so just say. And so one more question on this before we transition into a bit more conversation about the EVs. Um, what, with all of this wonderful change that you're seeing, can you forecast this hoax? What do you think? I know that they won't give up a fight lightly, but do you see hope and light at the end of the tunnel for these ridiculous things that are happening and that we're all funding with our tax dollars? And do you see this changing for our better?
There have been recent public opinion polls in the United States that show the public has really had enough of being force-fed wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, heat pumps in place of gas furnaces and what have you. This is everything from offshore wind to onshore wind. With these, aside from being ugly as sin,
Yeah,
all they're doing is producing intermittent, which is a polite term for unreliable energy. You
that's right.
cannot possibly power uh, a sophisticated high-tech society such as the United States on intermittent energy. As someone put it, you can't power a full-time economy on part-time energy. And what they're trying to force on us, for the most part, is nothing but part-time energy. So, yes, I think people are at long last seeing through this. Those who have benefited financially or politically from this, they will continue to resist. But I think the vast majority of people are saying, no, I don't want to go there. We'll be talking about EVs in a minute. Over 93% of the vehicles sold in the US today are still gasoline-powered vehicles. What does that tell you? That tells you that for all the goodies that were handed out and all the propaganda that was spread, EVs don't meet Americans' needs, and the Americans are voting with their wallets against these things. And they're doing that, or beginning to do that, really across the board. They're being asked to make sacrifices, but those sacrifices are being made to no good end.
Well, exactly. And when it comes to the EVs, I have a couple comments before I want to hear yours. Um, so the things that concern me, we have heard about EVs that, for example, in Florida, when saltwater hit them, I think they blew up and
Mhm.
were impossible to put out. So we're hearing of these cars just exploding. The
Yes.
other thing that concerns me are these fields that we see of these cars, because once the battery's bad, no one can afford the battery. So you see this
Right.
horrible environmental mess. The third thing is, so and not that this is funny, but if we can have any levity in this conversation, as a human resource consultant, I was filling a job opening for one of my clients, and we were looking at people involved in city planning and zoning. And some town in Texas got grants to buy an EV bus. They decided to have an EV fair and show, maybe Dallas, Houston, I can't remember, and show the world how wonderful these things are. So they brought all these EVs there, including this EV bus. Well, what happened was the charger for they plugged the bus in the charger and it caught fire. Not that that was funny at the time to then, but when I heard this, no one was hurt and no one was in it. But what happened was they needed a special whatever to hook it to, and they hadn't thought that through. And whatever the bus was supposed to be plugged in wasn't there, something else. And so anyway, yeah, the thing caught fire and wouldn't get put. So anyway, just a little levity to the EV story. Again, no one was hurt. But I would love to hear your thoughts on EVs.
Stop and think about how we began driving cars. Now, this was a generation of over 100 years ago when this thing called the horseless carriage came from seemingly nowhere. It was developed, by the way, just a few years after we developed the bicycle. So we went from bicycles to cars in a relatively short amount of time. Now, that wasn't anything that the government mandated. That wasn't anything that was subsidized. People noticed, hey, this really works better than the horse, which was our main mode of transportation
Sure.
all the way up until the turn of the 20th century. Now, think of a city the size of New York or Chicago or London or what have you, and the main mode of transportation there were horses. Well, that creates a problem with, we'll phrase this delicately, horse droppings. Now, if you have hundreds of thousands of horses on the streets in densely populated cities, which New York was 150 years ago, much 125 years ago, much less now. Just imagine
I can't.
the odor. It must have been overwhelming. The air quality, hideous. So anybody who tells you, well, automobiles pollute, put 1 million horses in the 5 boroughs of New York, and I'll give you air pollution likes of which you couldn't possibly imagine. So,
I won't try.
but the point here is that once the automobile came along, it was an innovation. We
Yeah.
improved it. We did this. We did that. They went faster. They became safer, and blah blah blah. Because that's what competition does. The laggards were weeded out because that's just the way life is. Contrast that with the Biden administration's imposition of de facto electric vehicle or EV mandates. What did they do? They set up a scheme that effectively regulated gasoline-powered vehicles out of existence. So we were going to sooner or later be forced to buy EVs, whether we wanted them or not, or whether we could afford them or not, because they cost more than gasoline vehicles. They cost more to purchase. They cost more to operate, what have you. And then there's that little problem of, well, you have to charge an EV.
And not blow your house up.
And not only blow your house up, and by the way, EVs are very combustible. Look, gasoline-powered cars can catch fire, and they can go up in flames. But those fires, which are few and far between, pale in comparison with the fires from EVs. That's a result of all the batteries, the tightly packed batteries that are in EVs. That once a spark happens there that shouldn't have happened, those things can go up in smoke very quickly. These fires are very difficult to put out. They require 10 times the amount of water to extinguish an EV fire than it does to put out a fire in a gasoline-powered vehicle. These things, by the way, don't work at all in extremely cold climates. Think of northern Minnesota, North Dakota, Manitoba, Alaska, EVs in January. Good luck, folks. If you're trying to get from point A to point B, it's not going to happen. By the way, they don't work well in hot weather either. So the desert Southwest, summer in Georgia, where I'm from originally, or Florida, Alabama, not going to work that well there either. And they're particularly not going to work well because the same government that was in the process of mandating electric vehicles was all put itself in charge of coming up with a nationwide network of charging stations. And to that end, they spent $500 billion with the goal of putting up 750,000 charging stations throughout the United States. Now, that bill was passed in 2022. 3 years later, how many do we have? At last count, we put up somewhere in the mid-60s, 63, 64, 65 for the whole country. Now, Tesla has its own. that Tesla has its own networks, but the government supplied rapid recharging stations, which are not rapid because even the ones they put up don't work half the time.
Exactly. And the
It
lines.
takes a month of Sundays to recharge them. It has been a gigantic fiasco. So it just shows you how much real thought went into this. But we're told we must be all electric because this is the only way we can rid our ties to fossil fuels and move on to the great green energy transition. And that has shown itself to be a complete fiasco. Trump, the administration, has now cut off all funding for this gigantic recharging network, which is just as well like the bullet train in California.
Yes.
It's never going to be completed anyway, so you may as well cut your losses and get out of it.
That's right.
And the thing about electric vehicles, or one of the things about them, is they don't really fill the needs of most people. If you have to go long distances, they don't have the range. Never mind, there's a lack of recharging stations. They, to the extent that they work at all, not larger vehicles. The larger the vehicles, the heavier they are. An EV SUV and a gasoline SUV of the exact same size in terms of their dimensions. The EV weighs twice as much, which means that the wear and tear on roads and bridges is much greater, which means that you're going to have to dig deeper if you're a taxpayer in whatever jurisdiction you're living in to maintain the roads, which are being systematically torn up by EVs. Again, something that was not thought through. They even want to extend this, not just beyond personal transportation. California, in its infinite wisdom, wanted to mandate EV trucks. Think 18-wheeler EVs. The weight of those trucks would have been absolutely astronomical. They would have been so inefficient. These are the 18-wheelers. They're moving vans and the other big long-distance trucking that carries so many goods around the country. They would have not had the range. They would have had to recharge again and again and again at a much higher cost than gasoline-powered trucks, which cost would then have been passed on to people going to the local supermarket to try to buy food. So the whole thing was a complete fiasco. No real thought of people living in the real world went into this. And to its credit, through the enactment of the recently passed big, beautiful bill, those subsidies, $7,500 per vehicle. You got a tax credit if you qualified for it. Those things are being phased out. Good. Which is a good thing because it was tilting the playing field in favor of a product for which there is demonstrably no real market. So it's a gigantic boondoggle, and we can be very happy that we are now moving away from that.
That is such good news. And I love your sense of humor. When you put the phrase California and wisdom together closely in a
sentence, I know, right? Yeah.
I thought, wow, what an oxymoron right there.
Completely. Yeah.
So I love your sense of humor. And I'm so glad to hear that about the EVs, because that was getting disastrous. And we were having loss of human life. I remember a couple years ago in Texas, they had a really bad winter storm. They were dependent on, Texas had converted so much of their energy to the wind, and this winter storm came and people were dying in their houses because there was no power to provide heat. So it's really been criminal, the whole climate hoax thing. But the electric vehicles specifically, Everyone knew that that wasn't going to work before they started. And yet, to be forced to watch your tax dollars go towards something that we all knew uses energy anyway. They were trying to say it was going to be such a reduction in energy, but I was hearing reports of all the energy that it took to create them. And I thought, this just makes no sense.
It doesn't. Wind power and solar power being intermittent destabilize the grid. Now, we have enough problems with our electric grid around the country as is. The last thing we need to do is force the grid to take on more intermittent energy. It will further destabilize it. And of course, the proliferation of EVs, as well as the proliferation of heat pumps through this magnificent transition to green energy. Electrification, we were told, was the future. It's a future of unmitigated horrors, astronomical prices, again, regressive. People of middle and lower incomes were the ones who were going to have to dig deepest here. And we were undermining ourselves. And by the way, who would really have benefited from this, in addition to purveyors of green energy and green technologies in the U.S.? The raw materials that go into wind turbines, solar panels, EV batteries, and batteries used for backup storage for wind and solar when the wind decides it's not going to blow and when the sun decides it's not going to shine. Who's the world leader in that? Answer: People's Republic of China. So what the United States was doing was engaging in unilateral economic / geopolitical disarmament by turning away from energy resources, coal, oil, natural gas, and for that matter, nuclear energy, and embracing green technologies, primarily wind and solar and battery powers, over which China has a virtual stranglehold on the supply chain. This was lunacy on an epic scale.
Your command of the English language is just astounding. So the word disarmament, absolutely, that's what was happening. This was a disarmament, and people need to think about that. The how close we came, which brings me to the third topic and final topic I wanted to cover with you today, which is Chevron and related issues, because the three-letter agencies have gotten so much power. I know, again, day job, human resource consultant. I'll deal with the EEOC, OSHA, et cetera. And yeah, it's my thing. But they are countries in themselves, and they are constantly putting out rules and regulations. And this is what they call it: regulations, guidance, letters. But I mean, if you don't comply, they will sue you and they will fine you. They are governments in themselves. And so poor employers, I'll tell people, this isn't the law. This wasn't passed by Congress, but you're going to have to decide your risk factor. What is your risk tolerance? Because when these people come after you, I've often thought that the employees are on commission with the fines that they get, but I'm making that up. But maybe I'm not. I don't know.
Actually, they do. They do get promoted. The more people they deem, the better their chances are of being promoted from here in Washington. From a GS7 to GS8. Hey, it's more money. So they have a financial incentive to go after people. Absolutely. They can show what a great job they're doing.
Money. So my experience with them, just on a professional level, has been that they are like the president. They're like all three branches tied into one. I mean, they adjudicate their own laws that they make. It's just a crazy. So anyway, please speak to us about. I believe we've had some victory and some freedom in this.
That's right. Every rule and regulation imposed by the federal bureaucracy is in one way or another connected to a law that was enacted by Congress. These rules and regulations have the force of law behind them. And when bureaucrats determine that you should do X, your failure to do X is then construed as you're violating the law. In other words, unelected and unaccountable federal bureaucrats, whether they're at the EEOC, the EPA, whatever that agency is, these people have become de facto lawmakers.
Yes.
They were elected. They were elected by nobody. They're accountable to nobody.
Right.
But they were imposing their peculiar will of the view of the world on the rest of us. And this has really been going on ever since the New Deal. And it got worse and worse and worse. And so that unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. were effectively running the show. Congress stood by, and other than the occasional complaints, did absolutely nothing over the years to roll this back until a couple of very important court decisions came along that finally started reining in the completely out of control federal bureaucracy that we had, in which agencies really became states within a state. One of those was the one you mentioned, Chevron. This is the
Yes.
policy of Chevron deference, which refers to a case dating to 1984 involving the oil company Chevron. All laws that are passed are somewhat ambiguous.
Yes, they are.
And okay, what did they really mean when they said X, Y, and Z? Well, under the legal doctrine of Chevron deference, owing to a Supreme Court decision, it was left up to the agency in question, the agency which has jurisdiction over whatever it is that you're talking about, to decide what it meant. In other words, this put more power into the hands of federal bureaucrats because it was they who determined what a law really meant, what Congress really meant when it wrote this poorly worded law. Well, so this gave them a power that the framers of the Constitution, of course, never intended, because this power flies in the face of separation of powers, under which the legislative branch enacts laws, the federal, the executive branch oversees that, the judicial branch or implements them, and the judicial branch then determines what is constitutional and what is not. Well, that whole separation of powers then became top heavy because the executive branch agencies, the bureaucrats that you have to deal with, and all of us in one fashion or another have to deal with, obtained so much power that they became the ones who were really running the show. Well, owing to a decision that was mercifully handed down last year, the whole notion of Chevron deference was overturned completely. Now, when there is a question as to what a law meant, that is now settled in the court system. Courts are imperfect, but at least if you don't like the decision that you get at a lower court, you can appeal that up and down the line. There is some element of accountability there, where there was absolutely none whatsoever under Chevron deference, because the bureaucrats were essentially handed a regulatory blank check. There was another decision handed down, this one dating to 2023, and that was West Virginia v. EPA. That decision greatly, and I do mean greatly, restricted the power of federal agencies to make stuff up on their own. They would say
All the time.
that in their implementation of the Clean Water Act, let's just stick with EPA because that was the agency in question here. In their implementation of the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, they would come up with a new rule or regulation saying, thou shalt do X, Y, Z, whatever it is, or thou shalt not do X, Y, or Z. And because there was no one restraining them, this got completely out of control. It got out of control so much that these agencies became de facto lawmaking bodies. This was, if anything, was even worse than the Chevron thing because you had agencies making up rules and regulations, each one with the force of law behind it, and they were making these things up out of whole cloth.
Yes.
So what the Supreme Court did is said, no, we're putting an end to this. If your rule and regulations has a major economic impact, and just about every rule and regulation they come up with has a major economic impact, unless you can show me or show a court the sentence or the paragraph in law that Congress passed, say, giving you that power, then you do not have the power to do that. In other words, the whole notion of laws being de facto made by bureaucrats was greatly reduced, and it restored the separation of powers, which our founders intended, because although they could have never have imagined the alphabet soup of agencies that sprung up in Washington, D.C. when they wrote the Constitution almost 250 years ago, they did understand that if you allow one branch of government to become completely dominant, then the republic is in real trouble. So that West Virginia v. EPA decision is very important because it reins in what had become the virtually unrestricted power of unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats.
That just makes me so happy on several levels, both as a professional and personally. So then, based upon this, do you foresee any of these agencies on their, and this is probably a facetious, I'm not being facetious, I'm actually being serious, but do you believe any of these agencies on their own will start rolling back their laws that they have created that don't actually exist in their...
Actually, great question. Actually, it's already happening.
Yeah.
Particularly at no other agency more than actually, it probably the most egregious offender of all. That's Environmental Protection Agency, EPA.
Yes.
Under the current administrator, Lee Zeldin, he is looking at some of the crazy rules and regulations that EPA has imposed over the years and saying essentially, no way, Jose. We don't have the legislative authority to do this.
Wow.
It does a tremendous amount of harm, and they are rolling back regulations there at an incredible, absolutely incredible pace, while at the same time they're also reducing the size of the agency because it like every other bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., and in God knows how many state capitals around the country, as a bloated, these bureaucracies are bloated. And who needs all of these people when a lot of the tasks that they are performing can actually be done by artificial intelligence, to be not too blunt about it, but it's absolutely true.
Yes.
And so you are seeing, ironically, the biggest rollback of regulations taking place at the most egregious offender of the administrative regulatory state, and that's EPA. Now, should in the future a Democratic government come into power, administration come into power in Washington, you will see certainly efforts on their part to reinvent the wheel, to go back to the future, so to speak, and make those agencies every bit as powerful and as unaccountable as they were. But they would then still be operating under the Supreme Court restraints in the decisions I've mentioned, as well as others that have been handed down. So I don't think we will see, certainly in our lifetimes, the administrative regulatory state in Washington as powerful as it was just 3 or 4 years ago, irrespective of whatever administration is in power in DC.
Well, that's good news, and that's a lot of hope. And I so appreciate all the hope you've brought today. Before we wrap up, I want to thank everyone in the comments section. We're having several people. We have thousands live across all social media platforms. God bless you, and thank you so much for tuning in today. We have several people reposting the show. I want to personally thank a couple, DPFS98 and Grin Grow. Love that. Thank you so much for reposting. Very gracious and kind, as well as the others. And for time, I am not able to read out all of the comments, but thank you all so much for those. And then in closing, so Bonner, I've asked you to cover several topics that one alone could have taken a full hour, if not longer. And you've been so gracious to train us and educate us on these things. Is there, what would you say to us in closing?
I would say in closing, pay very close attention to the words of people who have taken it upon themselves to act as our protectors, to act as those who are going to take us so gently by the hand and lead us into a utopia that they say will absolutely solve all your problems, enable you to live a happy, wonderful life. Be very skeptical of these people because they have their own agenda, and that agenda is most of the time diametrically opposed to what's really in your interest, what's in the interest, the best interest of you and your family. And there's no need to listen to these people. You should take them seriously to the extent that they're seeking power over you. And I think it's really incumbent on all of us to recognize what real agenda they are pursuing. The climate, for instance, is nothing but a pretext for a gigantic power grab. Once you understand that, then you see what these people are really up to. And that's why it's important for you to say, no, I won't go there. And to use this podcast as well as the many others that are out there, along with the wonderful, many of the fine journals that we have online or hard copy or whatever, but an informed public, a public that's not going to allow itself to be brainwashed into doing things that ultimately are going to take us down a road that does not have a happy ending. Those are the things that we need to do to protect ourselves and ensure that we really do have a prosperous and happy future.
Amen. Amen. And how can people follow you? I've actually had a ticker going the entire time with your website, but tell me your website, how people
check us out on our website. You'll find some really fascinating material there, and that's very simple. It's the website for a committee for Constructive Tomorrow, and that is CFACT.org, CFACT.org. Check us out.
Wonderful. And for my radio audience, I have had a ticker going across the bottom, but I have a lot of websites and social media, but they're all listed on my primary website, which is the letter Q, which stands for quantum, but the letter Q and the word grit, GRIT.org. That's the website for helping with the aftercare of children who've been rescued from trafficking, both above ground and below ground, as well as adults survivors who still need help, and those with any type of trauma, because trauma is trauma. So be sure to reach out there, and you can find all my social media sites. And thank you again, Bonner Cohen, Dr. Bonner Cohen, for being with us today. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And until next time, Godspeed to us all.
Thank you.
Breaks the shadow of the weary heart. Truth cuts the dark like a flaming dart. Voices rising strong to lift the call.